Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel for the Opportunity Institute. Welcome to Transfer Pathways and Social Justice, our panel for today. My name is Michael Rosenberg. I'm a senior policy analyst at Penn State University, and like to give my co-presenter a chance to introduce herself.
I'm Michele. I'm the Director of Prior Learning at Penn State University.
Our hope for this workshop is that we're going to be able to help you break out of what I term the circle of transfer frustration. And I don't know of anybody who has worked in transfer who hasn't experienced this in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And it basically starts out like this. You come up, you're doing the work that you're doing, and you come up with an idea, and you say, hey, we've got this great idea for improving outcomes for transfer students. And you take this idea and you run it up the flagpole, and you get asked, well, how does this help the institution? How does what you're proposing help the institution? And you're like, well, duh, because it helps students. That's why we're coming up with this idea anyway. And so they tend to ask you, well, why is your idea more important than all of these other priorities that we have at the moment? And so what do you say? Well, because it's equity, it's fairness, it's the right thing to do. And so you say that you believe in this stuff, and so it's equity. You want to do the right thing. And so they've heard this a million times before. And they say, well, get in line, and we will try to, and we'll come back to you. And then, sometime down the line, you get an idea again. So the reality of the situation, and this is one of the great things about being in higher education, is that we work with smart, passionate people, and smart and passionate people have good ideas on a regular basis. And the fact is, as we all know, we have limited time and resources to enact these things that we think will help students. But the fact is that opportunities do exist to advocate for boosting transfer students within your institutional priorities. And so that's what we're going to get at today. Our agenda for today, going to take just a couple of minutes and talk a little bit about sort of how we came to this work, how we came to this transfer work. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about a different way of framing transfer that might work a little better in being able to communicate your ideas at your institution. Talk a little bit about a theoretical basis for this frame, and then some of the ways that, like here at Penn State, we are using some of this theory to tailor transfer and improve the work for our students coming in. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about transfer, or about thinking strategically about how to get this stuff enacted. But before we jump into that, I just want to introduce ourselves. We'll give us a chance to introduce ourselves to you. Again, my name is Michael Rosenberg, and I have been working in higher ed for longer than I care to admit. I started out in residence life and then ended up in academic advising and academic coaching. And then eventually became, at a community college in Northern Kentucky, I was their first director of transfer. And that's where I really got involved in this work. And so I did that for a while, and then I ended up doing some consulting with the John Gardner Institute, and we ended up co-editing a book together, which we'll talk about, called The Transfer Experience, which has some good ideas for transfer in a lot of different places in the institution. But that's really where I've gotten involved in a lot of this stuff, and a couple of our fellow Opportunity Institute folks helped write some information for the book. So now I've come to Penn State, and I work in the Office of Planning, Assessment, Institutional Research, and the strategic planning side of things. And so that's where I am. I'm originally from Eastern Kentucky, so that's why I come by my y'all very honestly, as does Michele, who I will allow to give her introduction at this point. So, Michele.
Well, thank you, Michele Rice. I spent 13 years teaching and advising adult learners in addition to coordinating program and course learning outcomes in the technical college system of Georgia. And I married and relocated to Pennsylvania and spent 4 years as the Dean of Teaching, Learning, and Assessment at Penn Highlands Community College. And when Penn State decided to open their prior learning assessment office in 2014, I became the director, and I work with transfer and other ways to earn credit for prior learning, and I do a lot of working with faculty in that regard.
Michele is also the lead of, she's also the convener of our Transfer Governance Council at Penn State, which we'll chat a little bit about a little later. But well, so without further ado, we can jump into this. And I want to start out by thinking about the life of a transfer student. Now, this is what you might consider a quote unquote typical transfer student, even though there is no, as we all know, there is no such thing as a typical transfer student. But just the basic, sort of the basic life flow of a student. It kind of runs something like this. And again, this is very general. I know that there are lots of different paths that people can take, but just to think about the traditional 2+2 community college to 4-year institution path that a lot of us think of when we're talking about transfer students. You know, you have the stuff that happens pre-enrollment. Orientation advising and whatnot, getting into classes, then taking care of any kind of, then doing your coursework, gen eds, pre-major, doing a little career exploration. Then comes the move. Whether you finish 2 years of school or not, you move on to a new institution, or you go between campuses, or whatever it is whatever your move may be. And then you have to go through that process. Then you end up at your next institution, and you try to fill in any gaps and get that done. And then hopefully at the end, you come out with a bachelor's degree. Now, most institutions, when they talk about transfer, where they're mostly concerned is right here. This point right here, the transfer move, the actual sort of the processes, the policies, the procedures that come with moving a student going from one institution to another. And that's where the lion's share of the stuff gets done. Unfortunately, for a student, that's not really reflective of their experience in higher ed. What they do is we like to think about it as the transfer experience actually lasts for a student from the first time they step foot on a campus or log into an online program until the end. And so for them, it's their entire academic experience. And it's very helpful to think about that think about transfer in those terms. And this is where we start getting into the new frame. Because if we are telling students that this is a viable pathway, we tell students this is a viable pathway. You can do a 2+2, a 1 and 3, a 3 and 1, whatever you want to do. But this is a viable path to get yourself to a bachelor's degree. And if you talk, and there's lots of, there's the research out there, and the Community College Research Center said basically 85–90% of students, community college students, say they want to eventually get a bachelor's degree, but only about 15 or 16% make it the whole way through. So what you end up with is a bunch of students with a bunch of credit and a bunch of debt and no degree. And if this is what we're saying, and the way that we've kind of set up the economy and whatnot, is the baccalaureate is sort of your key to economic and social mobility. So if we are taking transfer students, this pool of transfer students, and saying this is the way you got to do it, and the system is not set up to support transfer students in this transition, in this time, then the system, not necessarily intentionally, but the system is discriminatory against transfer students. It is not set up for them to succeed. So that's why I say, especially since the biggest source at a lot of institutions of non-traditional students, of minoritized students, of adult students, veterans, all of these different types of students who tend to do a lot of transfer. If that is the source, if that's the source that they're coming from, most of them come in as transfer students, then we are not doing these populations justice. So I say what are the frame that as we were putting together the book, um, we thought about social transfer as a social justice imperative, as a way to work on economic and social mobility for these populations of students. And so that's where sort of all of our work is grounded, is in this idea of transfer as a social justice imperative. Now, there is we had to come up, we decided we didn't want to throw a frame out there that didn't have some kind of theoretical background. And so we have a theoretical basis for this idea of transfer as a social justice imperative. This includes Burton Clark's 1960 article that's still getting argued about today, the notion of cooling out, that institutions exist to track students into either a baccalaureate or non-baccalaureate track, where students are sort of judged on where they're coming from. Again, there's debate around Clark's theory, but it's certainly worth looking at. The notion of Pierre Bourdieu's social reproduction theory that institutions tend to create more set up to reproduce certain elements of the social hierarchy. This is one I have particularly interested in, Frankie Santos-Lannon, his idea of transfer student capital, which I'm going to talk about a little more in depth, because I think that's something that's very important to understand and have an idea about. But it's the idea that students accumulate transfer capital by doing things that are behaviors that are pro-transfer. And finally, Herrera, Jane, and Bernal Melendez work in critical race theory and transfer receptive culture. They had a book that came out a couple of years ago called Power to the Transfer, which I really recommend folks take a look at. But they had some interesting ideas, especially their stuff around transfer receptive culture, around how important it is that institutions create a transfer receptive culture, and that takes everyone at the institution. So the framing principles for this notion of transfer to social justice imperative, basically for a four-part thing. First, the notion that equity and access and opportunity is a positive institutional goal. I don't think anybody can really argue with that. We talk a lot about access. We talk a lot, especially at a place like Penn State, where we're a land grant institution. We have 24 campuses, spread across the Commonwealth. And so we are big into talking about access and opportunity. Systemic conditions such as policies, practices, and processes may inherently advantage some students over others. Again, this is not to say this is done maliciously or with intent, but it just, a lot of times it's just how these policies and practices evolve. This is the third piece. Well-designed interventions can and often do improve outcomes for historically marginalized groups, while maintaining and often raising expectations and standards for all students. And finally, that ongoing advocacy and continuous evidence-based improvement are necessary for creating lasting change. And this is how we kind of framed up our notions of transfer and how to talk about transfer. Because I think that if you're just saying, well, it's a good thing to do for students, that's going to be inadequate to deliver the kind of message that you're going to want to get across as you're trying to put together a plan to improve transfer at your institution. One of the things is, again, as I mentioned, we talked about Frankie Santos-Lannon. I really like his work on transfer student capital. And I think it's really it's worth looking at, because it's a really nice way to frame up to frame up any kind of discussion of transfer. And there's a lot of things, a lot of practical applications of this theory that can be used. And just to give you a definition, transfer capital refers to how potential transfer students accumulate knowledge about the transfer process, such as understanding credit transfer, grade requirements for admission, articulation, course prerequisites, all of these kind of things, learning to manage moving through an academic system. And Lannon and his team hypothesized that the more transfer student capital students gain, the more successful they'll be with their transfer to a four-year institution, to a baccalaureate granting institution, and will improve their resistance to transfer shock, which was coined by Hills, which is the drop in GPA that usually accompanies changing institutions. So I think that transfer capital it's a really interesting concept that's worth looking at. In 2014, Kristen Moser, who is at, I believe, Iowa State, she looked at Lannon's work and she updated some of the survey instruments that were being used for this to look at transfer student capital. And she basically came up with that there are eight broad areas of transfer student wherein students can accumulate transfer student capital. And those are academic advising and counseling, going to get involved with advisors and counselors, improving learning and study skills, experiences with faculty and staff on a campus, specifically faculty and in-class interactions with faculty, financial aid and financial literacy, mentorship, and motivation and self-efficacy. These are sort of the 8 areas in which students, as they build skills in each of these areas, they become better students and more successful transfer students. And what we say for that is that sending and receiving institutions, regardless of where you are, need to embrace their joint responsibility for providing student assistance within these broad areas, because that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck as far as positive student outcomes, as far as those kind of things that we do. Now, every institution does this a little bit differently. I'm going to turn this over to Michele to talk about some things that we are doing at Penn State to be able to try to help transfer students succeed, and students with prior experiences, help them succeed when they come to us. So, Michele, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So for us, for me, it's about building relationships. Now, obviously, we think about students and faculty, students and advisors, but we also have administration and faculty, staff and administration, faculty and staff, everybody, and students. I work with over 250 faculty in 200 discipline committees as they evaluate credit for prior learning, which includes transfer at Penn State. And building these relationships involves transparency and consistency. I let everyone know what we're doing and why every time, and I behave the same way with staff and other administrators. And if I didn't have relationships, I could not do my job. Next slide, please. So we all work together on transfer, and that also means working with students and faculty at other institutions. And this has been done through articulation agreements, and they've been program to program. Sometimes they've been dual admission, but they haven't always been at all of our campuses. Next slide, please. However, we now have a template for agreements with 19 of our campuses, and this is going to allow us to build consistency and transparency. And the first step is to outline how we will accept the community college credits. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this is just a screenshot of an example for one program at one community college that's good for several campuses. Students won't have any surprises or any lost credits. That's, always what we hear. Transfer equals lost credits. And we mean to show and use those transfer credits. Next slide, please. So in addition, we're offering dual admission so that students can work with Penn State advisors, with transfer counselors. We've also developed a program that allows students that are building that transfer capital to earn micro scholarships to aid affordability. Next slide, please. And that program is called Raise Me Transfer, and it's available to Pennsylvania community college students who are doing the things that Mike was outlining: earning good grades, participating in co-curricular activities, volunteering, etc. And while they're earning those micro scholarships and building that capital, we are laying that foundation for them to be successful and avoid the transfer shock. Next slide. So this focus on people, on these relationships, is going to allow us to work through our policies, through our procedures, our processes, our products. At Penn State, we have a Transfer Governance Council that continues to assess what we can do to remove barriers and improve access and affordability. The council is a cross-functional team that makes recommendations for needed change. And together, we can get things accomplished and create those lasting changes that we outlined in the transfer student capital theory. Thank you.
So with those are, again, and there are lots of different interventions that you can use. And I'd like to just for a second, but there's something that I think, and again, I may be a little biased in this because this is where I work. This is the work that I do on a regular basis. But I want to go back to our buddy here who's stuck in the circle of transfer frustration. And a lot of it is being able to answer this question well, being able to answer when you have an idea, how does it help the institution? But how do you answer that question? That's very important. And I think that that's the notion of strategically connecting your transfer efforts. And again, this is about strategic planning. And everybody, I don't know any institution these days that doesn't do at least something in strategic planning, whether it's a place like Penn State where we're spread out and we've got thousands and thousands of students, or small liberal arts schools with 300 students. But they all have some kind of strategic plan. Now, how do people usually think about if you talk about strategic planning? How do people think about it? They have some different, you ask people, what is strategic planning? And you get a million different answers. Some people think that strategic planning is about setting large scale priorities. Some think it's about identifying, reducing waste and redundancy while streamlining processes. Some say it's building initiatives to move the institution forward. Other more cynical folks might think that strategic planning is for doing post hoc justifications for whatever leadership wants to do in the first place, to justify cuts to personnel and deprioritizing programs, or creating a plan which will be abandoned or largely ignored. Now, again, these are different ideas. I happen to fall more on the left-hand column there, but there is a common definition. And here's one, a formal process designed to help an organization identify and maintain an optimal alignment with the most important elements of its environment. Yeah, great. What does that really mean? Well, you can translate that as, where do we want to go as an institution? How are we going to get there? That is really what strategic planning does. But so great, I've just been rambling for the last 5 minutes about strategic planning. Why should you care about it? Why should this mean, how does this apply? Well, it gives you an opportunity to broaden the institutional awareness of transfer needs, issues, and realities when you get involved in working on this process. Because we work in a performance-driven environment. You probably heard a lot, your institution may be doing performance-based budgeting, and everybody's setting baselines and targets and new funding models that are some of them are enrollment-driven. So what are we going to do? So that's the environment in which we work more and more is performance-driven and outcome-driven. If you're involved in a strategic planning process, you get to learn how an institution really works. You get to see under the hood, to see how how things fit together. And it's really, and as Michele talked about, as far as getting involved when building these relationships that are going to help you. It is a great way to network and participate yourself in the priority setting process. So if you do not know where your institution's strategic plan is, when you get off of it, when you finish this video, I would suggest that you go find it, just so that you know where it is and read it. Well, the first thing you should read, I think, is focus on the mission and vision of your institution. And that kind of is the what do we want to be and how are we going to get there. And I had a mentor of mine, Ed Hughes. He was the president of the community college where I started doing transfer work. And he said, if you're ever in the middle of a difficult conversation and you're trying to get something done, if you're in the middle of a difficult conversation, always bring the conversation back to mission. Because if you can tie what it is that you're doing to what an institution says that it wants to do, you're going to have a stronger argument. Involved in that strategic plan is also going to be the core principles and foundations on which, again, this is what the institution says about itself. And it's the language that the institution uses to speak about itself. So you'll see what are our core principles? What are the foundations upon which we do our work? Being able to identify those is very important. You'll see what you might call the key performance indicators, which are indicators of progress, metrics, which can be baselines and targets. See what the institution, the old cliche goes, if you treasure it, measure it. And those are what the institution says, this is what's going to be important. We are going to be focusing on these particular areas and these particular outcomes. So then what you can do when you've educated yourself on that front is you can then connect your work and your students' experiences with the language of the plan. So you can speak the language of the institution. And that makes any kind of proposal that you make, if you can reference the strategic plan, if you can reference the institutional mission and vision, that just makes your pitch all that much stronger. And I think that can be it can be challenging, but that's the way to do it. So, but I think being able to raise awareness of transfer and transfer issues, again, be able to, as I said, be able to articulate the issues around transfer in the language of the institutional mission. Make sure you can talk about what your strengths are. What your strengths are as a program, if the work that you're doing, if you can demonstrate positive outcomes and why, you'd be able to scale things up if you get some assistance from folks who need it. And have ideas for yourself for goals, targets, and outcomes that you want to see. Because if you can show, here's what we hope will happen if we put our ideas into play. Being able to lay out from the beginning, it's not just, we hope things will be better. It'll be this much better. We will do, we'll be able to improve by X amount, but be able to set those goals and targets and being able to state what those are up front. I think that's what's going to be, that's going to help you out as you move forward and as you work here with your colleagues here at the Institute to put a plan in place. So again, I just like to throw this out there, and again, it may be just a shameless plug for myself, but I want to do it anyway. For more ideas, there is the book Transfer Experience, which again I was very proud to be a co-editor on. If you want to look more into it, the website on the screen will take you straight to it. If you have questions about anything that we've talked about today, one or both of us is going to be available during the Institute itself to answer questions about this stuff. So I think that we look forward to speaking with you about this. And with that, I would just like to thank you for being a part of this, for taking some time to watch and listen to us. And I hope that you're able to have a successful institute and a successful plan, and you have a great rest of your day. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.